Oh, Stalin was a mighty man, and a mighty man was he. He led the Soviet people on the road to victory. All through the revolution, he fought at Lenin's side, and they made a combination till the day that Lenin died. He said, come all you people, we must work with brain and hand. And then one day the Nazis came into the Soviet land. They plundered to the Volga, to Stalingrad. And then Joe Stalin said, come on, me boys, and kicked them out again. Oh, Stalin was a southerner, in Georgia he was born, where the oranges grow thick and fast and fields of waving corn. And Stalin is a farmer, his fingers they are green, and he has planted the biggest crop the world has ever seen. One day he looked upon the map and frowned and shook his head. There's too much brown and not enough green, these were the words he said. We'll have to change the weather, boys, he said, and then he smiled. So let's begin by planting trees along 3,000 miles. So Stalin rolled his sleeves up then and said it's time to start. The Volga River and the Don, they are too far apart. I think we'd better join them, so come and help me, pal, and we'll build a mighty waterway, the Volga-Don Canal. Then Stalin went into the north, and there saw rivers three, all emptying their waters into the polar sea. Now that's not right, Joe Stalin said, these rivers, they are ours. We'll turn them round and make them work and make electric power. There was a range of mountains that were standing in the way, so Stalin put his hand out and smoothed them all away. For Joe, he is determined to make the land all green, and that's the biggest project that the world has ever seen. Oh, Stalin is a mighty man, and he has a mighty plan. He's harnessed nature to the plow to work for the good of man. He's hammered out the future, the fortune he has seen, and he's made the worker state the best the world has ever seen.
주체의 사회주의를 우리 어떻게 성대로 지키는가를 세계여 보라. 조선은 결심하면 한다. 조선은 한다면 한다. 국민 백성의 영도 따라서 선군의 붉은 기 그 신념으로 조선은 결심하면 한다. 조선은 한다면 한다. 주체의 강성애국을 우리 어떻게 이 땅에 세우는가를 세계여 보라. 조선은 결심하면 한다. 조선은 한다면 한다. 장군님 애국의 뜻을 받들어 붉은의 정신력 그 배짱으로 조선은 결심하면 한다. 조선은 한다면 한다. 결심하면 한다. 조선 한다면 한다. Jagad negen artim terekci Ялтин дорогете боцима, Оданжини очисем, Одачимин очисем, Неште буни зостеховун, Неричи
Le Vietnam brûlait, moi je hurle Mao, Mao. Johnson rigole et moi je vole Mao, Mao. Le napalm coule et moi je roule Mao, Mao. Les villes crèvent et moi je rêve Mao, Mao. Les putains crient et moi je ris Mao, Mao. Le riz est fou et moi je joue Mao, Mao.
C'est le petit
L'impérialisme dicte partout sa loi. La révolution n'est pas un dîner. La bomba est un tigre en papier. Les masses sont les véritables héros. Les ricains tuent et moi je mue Mao Mao. Les fous sont rois et moi je bois Mao Mao. Les bombes tonnent et moi je sonne Mao Mao. Les bébés fuient et moi je fuis Mao Mao. Les Russes mangent et moi je danse Mao Mao. Diable dénonce, je renonce Mao Mao.
C'est le petit livre rouge qui fait que tout enfin bouge.
La base de l'armée, c'est le soldat. Le vrai pouvoir est au bout du fusil. Les monstres seront tous anéantis. L'ennemi ne périt pas de lui-même. Mao Mao. Mao Mao. Mao Mao. Mao Mao.
When I was young, I used to be as fine a man as ever you'd see in the Prince of Wales. He said to me, come and join the British Army. Tee-oo-ra-loo-ra-loo-ra-loo, they're looking for monkeys up in the zoo. It says, one, if I had a face like you, I'd join the British Army. Sarah Connan baked a cake, and so for poor old Slattery sake, sure I threw myself into the lake, pretending I was barmy. Tee-oo-ra-loo-ra-loo-ra-loo, I've made me mind up what to do. Now I'll work me ticket home to you and the British Army. Sergeant Healy went away and his wife got in the family way, and the only words that she could say was blame the British Army. Tee-oo-ra-loo-ra-loo-ra-loo, me curse upon the Labour Blue that took me darling boy from me to join the British Army. Corporal Sheen is a terrible note, just give him a couple of jars of stout and he beat the enemy with his mouth and saved the British Army. Tee-oo-ra-loo-ra-loo-ra-loo, I've made me mind up what to do. Now I'll work me ticket home to you and the British Army.
Ich trage eine Fahne und diese Fahne ist rot. Es ist die Arbeiterfahne, die Vater trug durch die Not. Die Fahne ist niemals gefallen, so oft auch der Träger fiel. Sie weht heute über uns allen und sieht schon der Sehnsucht ziel. Ich trage eine Fahne, das Rot der Arbeiter macht. Es hat die Arbeiterfahne bei Nacht mein Vater bewacht und hat sie mir früh übergeben, als Morgenrot stieg empor.
Утреннего стяг
не важен первый шаг. Слышишь, веют над страною ветры яростных атак. И вновь продолжается бой, и сердцу тревожно в груди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. Весть летит во все концы, вы поверьте нам, отцы. Будут новые победы, станут новые бойцы. Милости не жди, жизнь для правды не щади. Нам, ребята, в этой жизни только с правдой по пути. И он продолжает собой, и сердце тревожно в груди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь.
Hello, everybody, and welcome along. It is the evening of December the 23rd, and it is, of course, beginning to look an awful lot like a communist Christmas. So, hello to everybody who has joined us tonight, and we are here today to talk about Comrade Stalin on the occasion of his birth date. Excuse me. We are going to be doing tonight the latest in our series of programs dedicated to analyzing the selected works of Stalin in the volume entitled On the Opposition, which is a collection of all of the articles, speeches, and pamphlets that Stalin issued against the various oppositions, plural, that existed within the CPSU-B, Communist Party of the Soviet Union Bolsheviks, in the 1920s. Now, this stretches from 1921 all the way through to 1929, with the final defeat of the Trotskyites. And of course, the lead character in the oppositional movements is, of course, Trotsky, who we have discussed many times here. But there's other figures as well who we will come across today, people like Zinoviev. Earlier on, there was Alexandra Kollontai, who was part of the workers' opposition, who, incidentally, went on to a distinguished career in Soviet diplomacy and intelligence services. Trotsky, of course, went on to die in disgrace in 1940, a fascist collaborator, but more on that later. Today's article, though, and it's a speech which is delivered at the joint plenum of the Central Committee and the Central Control Commission of the CPSU-B from July the 15th, 1926. This is a work entitled The Anglo-Russian Unity Committee. And what this is about, it is an event that is of unique interest to those of us from perfidious Albion, because it is to do with the general strike of 1926. Now, if you're not from this fair or a cursed isle, depending upon your point of view, you may not know what the general strike of 1926 is about. This is, of course, the biggest single, probably the biggest single threat to the rule of the ruling class in the last 100 years. Now, I will caveat that slightly by saying there have been other times when the rule of the British ruling class at home has been shaken. 1945 was a severe threat to them. They used social democracy to diffuse the threat. 1968 to 85, there were several periods in which they were genuinely concerned that they were losing control of the situation in terms of the class war. So 1984 to 85, as maybe not a severe threat, but certainly a very significant struggle. 1970 to 74 probably matched or came close to matching the general strike in terms of frenzied activity and the paranoia of the ruling class. But 1926 is probably the moment when the ruling class had the most cause to be afraid, because for around a week, the industrial working class, and beyond that into the non-industrial working class as well in some respects, walked out in solidarity with the miners, the coal mining communities of Britain, who had been under a relentless attack from the coal mine owners in Britain since the end of World War I, suffering a series of pay cuts, because back then, in the 1920s, of course, the owners of the coal mines, well, many of them were from the landed aristocracy. The coal mines had, of course, all been set up in many cases in the countryside, in land owned by various aristocrats, and they, of course, came to own the mines that were sunk into the land which they owned. And they were waging a remorseless campaign of pay cuts against the miners. In fact, after World War I, British capitalism was in a severe crisis. British imperialism itself, the British Empire, was being rocked by the after effects of the Bolshevik Revolution. There was a serious campaign for Indian independence had been started, and the British imperial system was under siege in its major possession, its major territory that it controlled, which is, of course, India. There was a serious campaign led in the early days by communists in many areas of India to free that country from the enslavement that the British had subjected it to. They'd just lost, of course, although albeit in an imperfect fashion, the south of Ireland, the Irish Free State, as it was called then. They'd lost the war of Irish independence and had to make a series of concessions they did not want to make, even though they forced partition onto Ireland to cripple its development. Sound familiar? But the British imperialism had a lot of severe problems. It was also severely in debt to US imperialism, having borrowed many hundreds of millions to get it through the war against German imperialism. So the ruling class in 1926 has a lot of problems, and as is the manner with these things, they were trying to pass this on to the colonized peoples who they were subjecting to ever greater rates of exploitation, but also to the domestic working class, hence the war upon the miners. And this culminated in 1926 when the miners walked out and the rest of the working class declared their solidarity with the miners. And it's at a time with a growing influence of a still quite small Communist Party of Great Britain, as it was back then, and a very large influence that the still relatively new Soviet state was exercising over the imaginations of a growing number of British workers. And into this atmosphere of crisis and paranoia, there erupts the general strike, which starts as an act of solidarity with the miners, and it's an act that is pushed from the ranks of the unions. It's not something which is dreamed up by the leadership of the TUC. The leadership of the Trade Union Congress in 1926 was, politically speaking, no better than the leadership of the TUC now. Many of them would have come from more industrial backgrounds than they do now, but politically, the same character of people, the same bureaucracy, derived largely from the same labor aristocracy, or a similar layer, albeit the professions are different now. My point is, in terms of the character, in terms of the role that they played, it was no better then than now. What was different was, of course, you had these massed ranks of industrial workers prepared to walk out in solidarity with their fellow workers who were under siege from the employers, that is, the miners. And part of this, involving what we're going to be discussing today, was the Anglo-Russian Unity Committee. And this was a committee set up between the trade unions of the young Soviet state and the trade unions in Britain. It derived out of solidarity campaigns with the Soviet Union in Britain, and it was designed by the people who wanted to launch it in Britain as a way of influencing trade unionists in Britain to stand in solidarity with the Soviet Union. And that was one of its purposes. And it drew in even reactionary trade union leaders got drawn into this. And after the general strike was sold out in a calculated fashion by the trade union leaders and, of course, the Labour Party. The Labour Party tried to sell it out even before the TUC leaders did. The general strike ran for around about a week. And by the time the TUC leaders called it off, the strike was actually growing. More men, and it was mostly men back then, were coming out on strike as the strike was officially being brought to a close. See, what this general strike did was it tapped into a growing level of militancy and class anger that existed in the British working class at that time. Not just solidarity with the miners, but much wider issues. And the fear of the ruling class back then was that this would explode and get out of control very quickly. And one of their plans that they had, in terms of the plans of the British Imperial General Staff, was to actually fight an insurgency inside Britain itself. This is one of the plans that they had. This was their primary concern, in actual fact, up to 1939, wasn't an inter-imperialist war. It wasn't even going to war directly with the Soviet Union. They'd tried that and it hadn't worked out. Their biggest fear was that they would have to wage a counter-revolution inside Britain itself. And or even mutinies in the Navy in the early 1930s. So for all that the propagandists of the British bourgeoisie will tell you that nothing ever happens here, they were seriously concerned up to the late 1930s that they will be facing an internal revolt led by the industrial working class. And they were planning accordingly. And you saw some of that in the general strike in 1926 in terms of their efficient usage of modern communication techniques, the British state, that is. In Churchill was, of course, the man heavily involved in this. He was I think he was the editor of the strike-breaking newspaper called the British Gazette. They deployed tanks onto the streets. They used the early version of the BBC as what it's always been, which is a state propaganda channel. They organized mass scabbing operations. Had the strike continued much longer, it would have been turned into, it was becoming a revolutionary situation. There were elements of what communists referred to as dual power situations emerging, which is that in various local areas, and this is especially true in more militant areas such as the English Northwest, certain areas of the coal fields in Scotland, the Scottish steel towns, the Dockland areas. If you wanted to move anything in terms of goods through a particular area, the writ of the British state in certain areas stopped running, meaning that if you wanted to move through an area, you needed to get the permission of the local workers' council. And this was true for a few days in 1926. You saw the beginnings of working class power, dual power situations, where the power was in effect passing to the organized workers, which is why the TUC leaders, in their playing their traditional role, ran as fast as they could to sell it out before it could grow any further. This is the role they've always played. This is the role that we understand that they have played for all of their existence. A counter-revolutionary force dedicated to protecting the state and dedicated to protecting the bourgeoisie. Now, why do I give all of that as a precursor to the writing of Stalin that we're going to be examining today? I give all of that as a precursor because what this comes down to is a debate between Trotsky and Zinoviev on one side and Stalin and the majority of the party on the other about how to approach working with reactionary trade unions. More specifically, working with trade union leaders who are overtly reactionary, anti-working class, anti-militancy, who are leading sellouts of the working class constantly. How does one approach working in such unions? And the distinction here between Stalin and Trotsky is very interesting. Zinoviev plays a supplemental role. We'll talk about him in due course, because as we will see, Zinoviev was constantly flipping back and forth between the majority and the minority in the Bolshevik Party throughout most of his career. Right. So the contribution of Stalin to the Central Committee meeting opens as follows, and I will just read you the opening lines here. Comrades, we are passing through a period of the accumulation of forces, a period of winning over the masses and of preparing the proletariat for new battles. But the masses are in the trade unions, and in the West, the trade unions, the great majority of them, are now more or less reactionary. What then should our attitude towards the trade unions be? Can we, as communists, work in reactionary trade unions? Is it essentially the question that Trotsky put to us in his letter recently published in Pravda? There is nothing new, of course, in this question. It was raised by Trotsky and the ultra-lefts in Germany some 5 years ago. But Trotsky has seen fit to raise it again. Now, pay attention here to the opening lines here and what Stalin's talking about. He says it's a period of the accumulation of forces, a period of winning over the masses and preparing the proletariat for new battles. Now, what does that mean? That's his reference to the articles from this book that we've discussed in previous episodes in this series, which show Stalin's abilities as a political leader, as a leader of the proletariat, as a dedicated, as he would say, a dedicated student of Lenin. And what was Lenin's greatest gift, perhaps beyond any other? There were many we could cite. Lenin had the ability, through constant study and constant analysis, of the mood of the working class, the mood of the masses, to be able to identify when it was appropriate to move in it, for the party to move in a particular direction, and when it was not. When and how to identify when you could lead the masses in a particular direction and when you could not. Why was it, of course, to use the famous example, that it was right and it was the right moment to lead the insurrection in late October of 1917, but it wasn't right to do it back in July of 1917? Why was it that Lenin was able to identify the correct moment to go? Why did Lenin and the Bolshevik leadership oppose to the insurrectionary mood in Petrograd in 1917 in July, but push forward with it in October of that year? And it comes to Lenin's ability to analyze the broader mood of the masses and where they were in relation to political developments, what they were prepared to do, what they were prepared to embrace. And Lenin correctly analyzed that in July of 1917, the masses were not ready to move beyond the illusions of the bourgeois democracy that the February Revolution had given birth to. The advanced workers were. The advanced industrial workers of Petrograd in July of 1917 were demonstrating, demanding the bringing down of the provisional government. However, they did not at that stage, the Bolsheviks, that is, did not have the necessary support amongst the wider layers, the wider masses, did not have enough support amongst the peasants. And thus, Lenin analyzed correctly that this, if they'd have gone for it then, they would have been defeated and it would have been a disaster. As it was, they were almost, many of them were arrested, many Bolsheviks were killed by the counter-revolutionaries. Lenin had to flee into exile, even though he had opposed the insurrectionary mood of July of 1917. But they were able to continue working amongst the masses, winning over significant numbers of the peasants towards the basic program of peace, bread, and land. And then they were ready to win control of the Moscow and Petrograd Soviets, and to feel that they were in a position where an insurrection in October of 1917 could not only win power, but stood a good chance of keeping it. And so Lenin's judgment was proved to be correct. And Lenin insisted, in fact, this is one of the things that he wrote most about, was the appropriate orientation of the party to the masses at any given time. And this is what the discussion or argument between Stalin and Trotsky really does revolve around in the 1920s. If you notice that there's a theme in all of the debates between Stalin and Trotsky, it's not just between the two men, of course, it's between the majority and the very small minority in the party. It is about what is the right time to move in a particular direction. What should the relationship, let's recall the very first essay we looked at from Stalin. What should the relationship be between the state and the trade unions? Should the state just simply control the trade unions and direct them in a Prussian style, as Trotsky wanted to in 1921? Or, as Stalin advocated for, was the correct method to argue and persuade and try to bring the masses around to the point of view of the party, the point of view of the party and the state, and to keep the trade unions as a part of the partnership with the Bolshevik Party and the state, which is a relationship that largely survived for a long time in the Soviet Union. And it was Stalin's point of view that prevailed. When is the right moment to, of course, bring in the new economic policy? And when is the right moment to end the new economic policy? And when is the right moment to advocate for and pursue the 5-year plan for mass industrialization? And which is what Stalin's talking about in this first paragraph here. What he's referring to here is the need that the party had to win over the majority of the small and medium peasants, to Bolshevik policy with regard to land reform, and then with regard to later on to collectivization. It was the need to build up reserves of capital through having capitalists operate inside the framework of the Soviet state under the new economic policy, and to rebuild some economic activity. So then, when the 5-year plan was instituted, you were building off a more solid base, and you were advocating for mass industrialization, for collectivization through the party, and convincing the masses that this was the way to go. Whereas Trotsky, in the manner that he always did, said in the earlier 1920s, I believe in 24 and 25, was saying, we must do mass industrialization now. We must do it now. Just do it. Whereas Stalin and the others the others in the majority were arguing that the NEP hadn't played itself out yet. We had to reach the end of the process of the new economic policy. And we had to convince the workers and a great number of the small and medium peasants of the necessity of the party's actions. And if that was done, then mass industrialization could proceed via the first 5-year plan. And it was only when that moment was right, when the masses were ready, when the necessary foundations of industry had been rebuilt, when the necessary capital had been built up, only then could the 5-year plan be implemented. And Trotsky and his supporters to this day will claim that, well, Trotsky had the idea first. No, he didn't. I mean, the idea that Russia needed to be, that the Soviet Union needed to be subject to a planned mass expansion of the industrial base, all the Bolshevik leadership had agreed upon that. The question was not whether they should do it or not. The question was, when could we do it in such a way as that it was going to be embraced by the masses and have a higher likelihood of success. And this is Stalin, following from Lenin, understood that this had to be because Stalin was a true son of the working class and a true revolutionary, in the sense that he understood that the party, as Lenin emphasized, could not run ahead of the masses, because then a vanguard that runs too far ahead of the masses gets separated and fails. Nor should it lag behind the masses. It should be leading the masses, but should be constantly in touch with and interacting with them, as Lenin emphasized in What Is to Be Done and other works that many other works that he wrote on party organization. And that is a very difficult thing to get right. And of course, nobody gets it right all the time. But Stalin understood the process that he needed to go through. And Stalin, as a true revolutionary who sought to elevate the class he was born into becoming the ruling class, understood that this stood a much better chance of success if the workers embraced it. And this is the essence of the argument here. Because Trotsky goes on to argue the following. Now, I'm going to read you this, and be honest in the comments if what your instinctive response to it is. This is from Trotsky. This is an article he had published in Pravda on May 26, 1926, just after the British general strike had failed. Trotsky writes the following. The entire present superstructure of the British working class in all its shades and groupings without exception is an apparatus for putting a brake on the revolution. This presages for a long time to come the pressure of the spontaneous and semi-spontaneous movement of the framework of the old organizations and the formation of new revolutionary organizations as a result of this pressure. Now, you may read that, as I first did years and years ago, 20 years ago now, when I was a Trotskyite, and think, yes, what a revolutionary sounding thing. Yeah, the old unions, and he's not everything he says in that is wrong. He's right that the superstructure, the hierarchy, the bureaucracy of the British trade union movement in the 1920s and now are a handbrake on revolution. They're not only just a handbrake on revolution, they're a handbrake on any decent strike breaking out a lot of the time. But the question that Stalin is to go on to ask here is, well, okay, how do we respond to that? if the bulk of the workers are still convinced of the or at least they're going along with the old trade unions, the old trade union organization, if they're still members of the TUC affiliated unions, then what do? Do you just, as Trotsky was implying in not just this writing, but many others that he wrote at the time in a feverish fashion, that what should be done is the immediate launching of new and revolutionary unions in 1926. And if we build those, the workers will come to them. And Stalin's going to go on to argue that this is an ultra-left position. And he says the following in response to Trotsky. Is that policy correct? It is fundamentally incorrect. It is fundamentally incorrect because it runs counter to the Leninist method of leading the masses. It is incorrect because for all their revolutionary character, it is incorrect because for all their reactionary character, the trade unions in the West are the most elementary organizations of the proletariat, those best understood by the most backward workers, and therefore the most comprehensive organizations of the proletariat. We cannot find our way to the masses. We cannot win them over if we bypass these trade unions. To adopt Trotsky's standpoint would mean that the road to the vast masses will be barred to the communists. The working class masses will be handed over to the tender mercies of Amsterdam, to the tender mercies of the Sassenbachs and the Uregists. Now, the reference to Amsterdam is the Amsterdam Organization of Trade Unions. That was like a second international trade union group that met for a while in the period after World War One. It sort of petered out after a while, and the Sassenbach and Uregiest were like trade union leaders from that group. Now, what he's going to argue here, what Stalin argues here, is that he's not arguing that Trotsky's point about the trade union bureaucracy in Britain being counter-revolutionary is wrong. He's not arguing that point at all. What he's arguing is, okay, well, Trotsky, we could go and declare new organizations tomorrow, but given that the great majority of workers are still in the old reactionary unions back then, if we build it, they won't come, to paraphrase Kevin Costner. The aim of the communists, as Stalin emphasizes, isn't to build organizations and try and skip over the difficult and often tedious job of winning argument after argument, of advocating for a position within working class organizations that will not be listened to for many, many months or sometimes even years. Because the aim of the communists is to patiently work to bring the great majority of workers over to our point of view. And by doing that and being, open advocates of the communist point of view, we, through the diligence of our work and the persistence and rightness of our arguments, and of course the situation confirming the rightness of our arguments, can win over workers away from the influence of the leadership of the reactionary trade union leaders, which at the time was the most crucial task facing the Communist Party in Britain, which was still a new or relatively new party. It was only around about, by that stage, 5 or 6 years old. And it wasn't on the same scale, same size as the German party, the KPD, or the French party, the PCF, or even the Italian party, though that had been banned, of course, by Mussolini by then, because those all came from splits within much bigger social democratic parties of the Second International. The Communist Party in Britain was not a split, a massive split out of the Labour Party. The Labour Party is, in many respects, the most advanced and therefore was always the most degenerated form of social democracy, because it never even pretended to have a Marxist period. So there were people who left the Labour Party to join the Communist Party, of course, but nothing like on the same scale as there was in France or Germany or Italy, or later on, Spain's a bit of a different case. But it was small but significant. It consisted of a significant group of worker militants at the time, and its job was to peel people away, as Lenin said as early as 1921 in Left-Wing Communism and Infantile Disorder. The job was to peel workers away from supporting these reactionary leaders of these reactionary organizations, the Labour Party and the Trade Union Congress. And this is why Lenin suggested, when it came to the Labour Party back then, that the Communist Party should for a while pursue affiliation to the Labour Party. And Stalin goes on to talk about that very thing, which is that he following Lenin says that when you're looking to win over workers away from the influence of reactionary leaders like Ramsay MacDonald in the Labour Party, like Philip Snowden in the Labour Party, like Keir Hardie in the Labour Party. I know that those who worship him as some sort of saint are going to be offended by that, but he wasn't much better than his successors, or his ultimate successor, Sir Keir today. And then the leaders of the Trade Union Congress, who had sold out every militant strike going. So the argument isn't that these leaders are any good, or that these organizations and their hierarchies are ways to socialism. That's not the argument that Lenin or Stalin put forward in the 1920s. The argument was that we should, in the case of the Labour Party, the communists should have tried to pursue affiliation as an organization to the Labour Party. Because back then, theoretically, for a long time afterwards as well, you could become an organization that was a component part of the Labour Party. You could become an affiliate. And the conditions for that Lenin laid down was that the communists should seek affiliation, but should do so on the basis of not compromising their organization and not giving up freedom to criticize the reactionary leaders. Of course, the Labour Party always said no. Labour Party leaders always rejected the Communist Party's application for affiliate status, finding every kind of bureaucratic maneuver that they could possibly pull to block it, finding every kind of trick, making up rules if they didn't have them in place already, manipulating the ballots at conferences, because they knew very well, the likes of Ramsay MacDonald, who wasn't a stupid man. He was a dangerous reactionary, but he wasn't stupid. They knew very well that if they allowed the communists into the Labour Party, if they allowed them to have freedom of agitation, if they allowed them freedom of criticism, then the Labour Party leaders wouldn't stand a chance. If the communists went into the Labour Party and allowed freedom of operation, they would be winning over workers who were attached to the Labour Party and either members of it or who were just voting for it on a mass basis, because they would be in there subjecting the arguments of the Labour Party leaders to relentless criticism. And Labour Party leaders knew they couldn't win that argument. They knew they couldn't defend themselves, so they just banned the Communist Party from being part of the Labour Party. And eventually, of course, having been told no on various dubious grounds over and over again, the CPGB, as it was back then, stopped applying, because there was nothing more to be done. And the role of the Labour Party leaders had been exposed in a way, because they changed their own rules over and over again to block communist affiliation. So by forcing them to do that, the bid for affiliate status had served the purpose to a degree that Lenin had outlined in 1921, that Stalin had reaffirmed, which is that the job is to expose the likes of Ramsay MacDonald, to expose and the others in the Labour Party leadership as these treacherous reactionaries who were only dedicated to serving British imperialism. Well, how they'd acted with regard to the communists' attempted affiliation had exposed that in the eyes of many workers. And through that process, the Communist Party of Great Britain did grow as a result. So the tactic did work, not on the scale that we'd have perhaps wanted it to. We definitely not on the scale we'd have wanted it to. But it did expose to the advanced workers the role that the Labour Party leaders played. So the point that Stalin is making then isn't that this description that Trotsky gives of the trade union leaders in Britain is wrong. It's that Trotsky is doing what he always does, which is trying to skip over the bit where you actually have to win the workers over to your point of view. That's what he's arguing. So he then goes on, Stalin does, to talk about Trotsky's errors of the similar nature in the past. And Trotskyism continues to repeat these errors to this day. So in 1917, for instance, Trotsky and his followers, before they were in the Bolshevik Party, they were in the group called the Mezrayontsy, which is the inter-party group, I think is the rough translation. And they were a group that hovered between the Mensheviks and the Bolsheviks, sometimes dancing up to one, sometimes dancing up to the other, never really committing to either of them until the very last minute when Trotsky jumped and joined the Bolsheviks. Now, the slogan that Trotsky was putting forward in April of 1917 was, as Stalin says here, "No Tsar, but a workers' government." Again, sounds really revolutionary, doesn't it? But Lenin had to point out to Trotsky and his followers that this was wrong, that you were not at a stage where we can just rule out the need to win over the peasants, of course, who were still the great majority of the Russian population. You needed an approach to the peasants. You needed a policy that could address the wants of the peasants, and you needed to win them over to an alliance with the workers. So just saying workers' government, well, you're immediately shutting down discussions with the peasants there. Many peasants would turn their backs on you because you're not thinking about the need to appeal to them, as Trotsky consistently did not. And also, Lenin says that all the masses also include various lower members of the petty bourgeois as well, who, again, like, you need to have some kind of program that will bring them in to an alliance with the workers, which is why, like, the slogans they went into the October 1917 uprising with was peace, bread, and land. Because, like, these are slogans which are going to appeal to the masses and which are going to bring them in. And whether they are workers, because of course peace, the disastrous war waged by the Tsar on behalf of, well, the Russian bourgeois, but also mainly on behalf of French and British imperialism, had killed millions of workers and peasants and petty bourgeoisie as well, and had led only to a complete disastrous failure. And everybody who wasn't in the bourgeoisie wanted this thing to end. So peace was an appeal that would, of course, address the needs of the great peasant masses, because it was them that was doing most of the fighting and the dying. The same would be address the needs of the workers, and it would also speak to wider layers in the masses, such as the petty bourgeoisie. Bread, well, the Russian agricultural system was falling to pieces by October of 1917. There was hunger breaking out across the countryside on a huge basis. Even reactionary historians such as Orlando Figes, who's a rabid anti-communist, has to admit that the state of the country in, like, September 1917 was abysmal. The writ of the central government was falling to pieces. The Tsardom couldn't govern anymore. The population couldn't be fed. There was mass failure of harvest. There was too many peasants had been taken off the land and pressed into service in the army. It was a disaster. So bread addresses a rather urgent need to feed the population. Remember, the February 1917 revolution started with a bread riot, started by a group of women workers, because the Tsardom literally couldn't feed the people anymore. And then, of course, land, which, of course, speaks to the immediate concern of the small and medium peasant, which is redistribution of the great estates of the Russian landowners to the small and medium peasant, which is what was done in the 1920s. And so that program that you're going into the uprising with is calculated to win the support of the great masses, worker, peasant, and petty bourgeois, in the old Russian Empire that which was disintegrating in October 1917. That's what they went into that with. It wasn't going into it and screaming a workers' government now, which sounds like the most revolutionary slogan going. But again, you're not thinking about how do we bring the great masses with us. And again, it's not a matter of compromising yourself into non-existence. It's not a matter of tailing the masses. It's a matter of getting this balance right between addressing the needs of the masses and leading the masses towards the more revolutionary conclusion. You can't get peace, bread, and land in October of 1917 by sticking with Kerensky. Kerensky was owned and controlled by British and French imperialism and by American imperialism too, increasingly. And so they were invested in keeping the war going at all costs. He was very much the Zelensky of his day, Kerensky. Same role that he's playing, incidentally. Same first name as well, which unfortunately is my first name, but there you go. Kerensky was not going to give them bread because he could not. He had shown, not just him, but the entire bourgeois governments, all of the bourgeois governments that had existed from March to October of 1917 had failed to revive agricultural production. And they couldn't give the peasants land either, because they were tied into an alliance, an uneasy alliance with the Russian landowners. So the bourgeois democratic system that had been briefly come into existence in March of 1917 and ran till October of 1917 was fundamentally incapable, due to the system of class alliances it was in, of providing any of this. And this had been demonstrated to the masses. And so the Bolsheviks came along and with this program, which was deliberately broad in terms of and simple in terms of the demands that they were putting forward. But they put forward these demands, which they had knew, and which Lenin and the other leaders like Stalin had calculated, that these demands would be broad enough to bring in the great masses of the Russian population, but that they would be unable to be addressed by Kerensky. He and his government would not be able to address these apparently simple demands, because it would destroy the basis, the class basis of the government if he was to address them. And that is how they won the masses over to the side of the revolution. And Trotsky's workers' government now demand in April of 1917 would not have done that. It would not have done that, because you would have already alienated many of the masses before you even started. And I'll bring this right up to date. Well, maybe not right up to date, but within a few years. Back in 2013, I think it was, there was a strike that I was attending with others in the Trot group I was in, that took place on a vast industrial estate called Trafford Park. If you're from Perfidious Albion, you may know where it is. It was a very famous place of heavy industry in Manchester, less so these days, but there's still certain big industrial concerns there, like the Unilever plant. Unilever, which of course produces everything from washing powder to tea. And I went down there, handing out some leaflets. The Trot group I was in was very reformist and bureaucratic. They were big fans of winning positions within the TUC hierarchy. Now, we ran into down there another group of Trotskyites who were, in Britain, unfortunately, there's 500 different varieties of Trotskyite. There's more varieties of Trotskyite than fucking washing powder. But we ran into a group called the Socialist Equality Party, who perhaps represent the sort of the left element of Trotskyism. They came as a split from the old Workers' Revolutionary Party, which was an ultra-left cult headed by a degenerate called Jerry Healy, who ran it as a cult for many, many years. Incidentally, when it was started out, the WRP, because it spoke a very strident and militant language, did attract a number of worker militants to its cause, because by then, in the late 60s, early 70s, the Communist Party had had degenerated into a reformist charade, and militant workers didn't want to join it anymore. So tragically, a lot of them ended up joining like organizations like the WRP or the International Socialists, later the SWP, and other Trot group, who also at the time spoke a very militant tone about rank and file organizing, fight the bureaucrats, fuck these people, that kind of thing. And but then there would be the flip side of it. With the SWP, they would then go and say vote Labour at election time. WRP sounded more revolutionary, but they were on the ultra-left side. And I'll give you the example as to how. When we were there, talking to workers on this picket line, which, I mean, I die with embarrassment thinking back to the kind of bullshit leaflets that I was handing them, trying to get, I think, I'm not sure whether it was that one or another one, but on one picket line, we were going down there leafleting for Len McCluskey. And if you don't know who he is, look him up. He now writes poetry books with Jeremy Corbyn. But the SEP, Socialist Equality Party, this Workers' Revolutionary Party split, still that same ultra-left tone. Went along and were like, and now we must form Soviets, brothers. We must leave these reactionary trade unions and form workers' councils and start the revolution. And the workers on the picket line looked at them as if they were fucking crazy. Because again, like, if you're like 18 years old and you're angry and you read that on a leaflet and you think you're convinced of the need for a revolution, as I was when I was 18, and you read that and you think, great, fantastic, form the Soviets now, overthrow the bourgeois, let's do it. But of course, you've turned up to a picket line which consists of a bunch of workers who have just managed to hold a legal strike ballot in a country where it's very difficult to do that. And their concern is preventing redundancies, or their concern is winning a pay rise, or their concern is some other routine crime committed by the bosses, or in the case of the US, union recognition at Amazon via the Teamsters. And yet, so they're in a position where they've just had, they've, through their union organization, they've just won a ballot. They're on strike. They're out there trying to win their particular battle. And you, as a Trotskyite, turn up and start saying, forget the unions now. They're totally reactionary. They're led by these jokers. Leave them now. Form a Soviet. Start the uprising. Now, there's elements of what you're saying there which are true, which we know are true, just as what Trotsky said in 1926 about the trade union leaders in Britain being an active brake on the revolution. That was true. But then again, to go back to what Stalin's saying, okay, well, how do we address that? How do we get these workers, in our case, in the case I'm giving 10 years ago, 11 years ago now, who had just gone out on strike, many of them for the first time, many of them had no comprehension about what the fuck we were on about. So how do you, as a revolutionary, relate to that? How do you, as a communist, relate to workers who've just gone out on strike for the first time, who have no experience of industrial disputes, and you're turning up telling them to form a Soviet, a word you've never heard before, except in reference to the old Soviet Union, maybe if you're old enough, or you've never heard before. And that's your approach. Not only have you have run so far ahead of even the organized working class, that you've run over the edge of a fucking cliff. And this is the problem. It's one of the problems with ultra-leftism. It runs miles ahead of the masses. And I've experienced this because I've been an anarchist as well for my sins. You run so far ahead of the masses, and this is where Stalin has a great line on this later in the article, where he says that the left turn. Here we go. Yes, he says, but such is the fate of ultra-left phrasemongers. Their phrases are leftist, but in practice, it turns out they are aiding the enemies of the working class. You go in on the left and come out on the right. See, what happens with like ultra-leftists a lot of the time is that they scream and yell at the working class. We must do this now. We must have the revolution now. We must have the uprising now. We must get the guns out, comrades. And you wonder why so many of these people are, some of these organizations are riddled with police informants. And you've run far ahead of the class. The class doesn't listen to you or thinks you're mad, and you don't try to convince them. You don't try to persuade them. You just scream at them. And then when the class doesn't listen to you, you collapse into reaction. Say, oh, God, they're all reactionary. They're all terrible. These workers are hopeless. I'm off to become a liberal Democrat or something like that. But in relation to the line I've just read from Stalin, what Stalin's referring to is that by screaming and yelling and alienating workers and peasants and others of the great masses that you need to win over, what you're actually doing is you're aiding reaction, because what you're doing is you're basically making them think that communism, that the Communist Party is not listening to them, doesn't want to take into account their interests or their points of view, isn't engaging with them, is just screaming at them and then running away, and then denouncing them if they don't listen, which is the typical Trotskyite approach. And so what Stalin is saying here, in distinction to Trotsky, is that what you need to be doing, and this is why he defends the purpose of the Anglo-Russian Committee, is that what communists need to be doing, and he's saying that this is true of the Communist Party of Great Britain, and it's also true of the activities of the Soviet trade unions who are on this Anglo-Russian Committee with reactionary trade union leaders. Stalin's saying that, well, we're not there to convince these characters of anything. We know what their character is, what these reactionary trade union leaders are like. What we're doing here is hopefully exposing their role, building internationalist support for the Soviet Union, pressuring the reactionary trade union leaders through the Anglo-Russian Committee into hopefully opposing British imperialism's attempts to organize armed interference inside the Soviet Union. And more broadly, again, to go back to that point, winning the masses over to the communist point of view, which takes persistent and patient work. And you can't just skip over it by declaring that the trade union leaders are all reactionary, or we need a workers' government, or we need an uprising now, or something which, again, to your mind when you first become a revolutionary, sounds amazing. But then you need to ask yourself, well, where are the masses, and how do we lead them how do we engage with the masses and both lead the masses and learn from the masses to get them to the point where they're willing to take that next step with us. And that's what a true revolutionary should do. Constantly interrogate the methods that we're using, constantly interrogate the relationship we have with the masses, and not just scream slogans and hope that the masses become convinced by that, because they won't. And this is the point that Stalin's making over and over again to Trotsky, to Zinoviev, and others. And he concludes by saying that what Trotsky is in effect doing is, as he says here, I'll just read the quote to you. Trotsky takes as the starting point of his policy of theatrical gestures, not concrete human beings, not the concrete workers of flesh and blood who are living and struggling in Britain, but some sort of ideal and ethereal beings who are revolutionary from head to foot. It is difficult, however, to understand that only persons devoid of common sense take ideal ethereal beings as the starting point of their policy. That is why we think the policy of theatrical gestures, the policy of overthrowing the General Council, he means the TUC General Council, from Moscow by the efforts of Moscow alone, is a ridiculous and adventurist policy, which is exactly the right point to make. So I'll leave the comments on the article there. I would encourage everybody to read it. It's not that long. You can find it easily on the Marxist Internet Archive, which of course is run by Trotskyites. But it is a fairly comprehensive archive of Stalin's work. I am going to, in the new year, and this is a website announcement, start building a Stalin archive on my own website. I've just paid for the fucking thing again for another year, so I might as well use it more comprehensively. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start copying across as many articles and books as possible onto new pages on the website, so that you can all have access to it on there. And so that if certain websites get shut down, then the work of Comrade Stalin is available. Because as you can see, from reading that and from reading all the other things we've gone through in this series on the opposition, this is like Stalin's greatest asset is his understanding of the need to bring the masses with you, the need to convince the masses. And that's what he had as a skill that guided him throughout his political life. And this is why he was such an exceptional organizer and leader, because he had that understanding. And it's ultimately why he was the man who was able to lead the Soviet Union through World War II, whereas so many others in that position would have fucked it up, would have surrendered, would have done something stupid, would have lost their heads. The last man who was going to lose his head was Stalin, which is why the lies told by Khrushchev and repeated by fake historians like Sir Anthony Beaver about Stalin getting drunk and falling asleep under a table or hiding in terror was just simply untrue. And we know that's untrue because, of course, the documents are all out there now. And I'm wondering how long it will be before Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin is obliged to do a renunciation of the lies about Stalin. Surely that can't be far away, but I won't hold my breath. All right, so let's scroll up to the top, take some comments from you, the audience. Thanks to all 483 of you who are watching right now. Be sure to like and share this stream if you haven't done so already, and to subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. For some reason, Rumble wasn't working tonight, so that's why we're not live on there. It sometimes gets a bit temperamental. Maybe it's MI5 attacking it, who knows. So hello to Vision Pamet and Chris Rogers, and to Pavel Linovsky, and to Enigma. Hello to Stig Pedersen, to Robeson from Indonesia, to David, who comes to us from Bremen, to Jerry, and to Nikki and Kevin, who says, howdy, comrades. In the recent Irish general election, I wrote on my ballot, vote Stalin. Well, wasn't a lot of other choices there. In fact, that's the exact same thing I wrote on my ballot in the British general election. It was where there was even less choice. But that's by design, of course. Robeson says, I recently began watching The Unknown War. Has anyone seen it? An excellent 20-part documentary on World War II's Eastern Front that's presented by Burt Lancaster. Interesting. I have heard of that. I've not seen it, though. Is it on YouTube, that is? Hello to Bad Wolf. I don't know who you are, so I'm not telling you who I am. Hello to Victor. Hello to Nikki, who says, hypothetical question. How would the USSR led by Stalin handles today's clusterfuck? Kind of a strange question, Nikki, though I get where you're coming from. If the USSR still existed, then today's situation wouldn't be in existence. I mean, if you think about it, all of today's wars, most of today's wars, maybe not all of them, and the severity of the crimes of imperialism are a direct result of the fall of the USSR and the counter-revolution in the 80s. Think about it. To a large extent, their ability to destroy Yugoslavia stemmed from the fact that there was no real opposition to them anymore. Same is true for Iraq. Same is true for Libya. Same is true for Syria. They got blocked in Syria for a while by the actions of Russia and Iran, but ultimately they were able to prevail. And the fact they were able to launch their attack on places like Iraq, Libya, and Syria in the first place would not have been possible had the USSR existed, because all of these countries, even though with Iraq, it's the Ba'athist allegiance there was very dubious, but they did have good relations for a while with the USSR, albeit in the revisionist period. But the fact is that the USSR's existence, even in the revisionist period, enabled certain governments to exist that sat between the imperialist camp and the Soviet camp, like Baathism, like Gaddafi's Libya, like Nasser-era Egypt. And when the Soviet Union was destroyed by the counter-revolution, and of course China was not playing the role, and still isn't playing the role, of a center of global revolution, the space for all of these countries, from be it the remains of Titoism to Baathism to Gaddafi, the space that used to exist for these countries disappeared, and any protection that they used to enjoy, whether they were aligned fully with the USSR or not, from the USSR's existence, any protection that used to exist there vanished, and US imperialism was able to go on an absolute rampage. So to answer your question, if the USSR still existed, even in the compromised revisionist form, which we'll be coming back to at some point to look at that further, they wouldn't have been able to do what they've done. And if the USSR still existed, there is a reasonable argument to be made, although we are in the very, very perilous territory of what ifs here, that the severity of the capitalist crisis in the imperialist countries that gripped us since 2008 would have come much earlier and would have come at an even more intense level. So the crimes of revisionism and the crimes of Gorbachev cannot be overestimated. Could have been done away. Capitalism, more specifically, imperialism, could have fallen by now if the USSR, even in the revisionist form it existed in the early 80s, was still around. The severity of the crisis of imperialism would have been much worse because they wouldn't have been able to do all of that looting of the Soviet Union and the other former socialist states in the 90s and early 2000s had that counter-revolution not taken place. There is a chance that we could be living in a post-capitalist world by now, or there's a chance we'd be living in a never-ending war waged by fascist regimes in the West to try and desperately hold on to their power. There's various different outcomes that could have been possible there, but that is the essence of my point. If the USSR still existed, then the wars and the terror going on right now would not exist in the same degree they do now. Hello to Nush82, who joins us from the US occupied state of Australia. Hello to Agricola. Nikolai Vissarionovich, hello to you. Lucky Spears joins us all the way from Utah. Comrade Ian Foster is with us, as is Jenny, our moderator. Hello and thank you to you. Pavel says, I am being looked as a lunatic by my liberal anti-communist parents. However, I have to be fair. Communist Poland was not able to deliver the medication I needed, so they moved to Germany. Well, I don't think Poland was ever really communist, mate. It was a people's democracy. There was a certain elements of economic planning there. Where we are going to do a show on Poland. There were certain achievements in that time. Certainly, it's better than what is there now, but there's a lot of problems there from the very beginning, and we're going to be looking at that in the new year. Hello to Harold. Hello to Comrade Jawad. Hello to Bishi. Hello to David Greenwood. Hello to Hen's Teeth. And hello to Jessica Fitz and Spurious Furious. Nikolai asks, what are the current prospects of socialist restoration in the Russian Federation or other former Soviet republics? Better than they were 5 years ago, Nikolai, is my honest answer there. Much better. I mean, if even Harper's Magazine is admitting that the reputation of Stalin has not been this high, certainly in Russia and Belarus especially. I'm unsure of the Central Asian states because I don't know enough about the mood within them. If we've got any Central Asian viewers coming to us from Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, Turkmenistan, or Tajikistan, drop me an email, let me know how things are going there. I've heard very contradictory things. But with regard to Russia, look, even bourgeois sources have to admit that the reputation of certainly Stalin and the Soviet period has been elevated hugely. You now have Putin, the man who defined himself as an anti-communist for a long time, and Medvedev too. In fact, that whole leadership having to lean into the Soviet legacy ever more. They still do the fucking stupid czarist bullshit, but everything they're laying claim to now is very little to do with the legacy of Tsardom. That's just for, memes done for the Dugin crowd. Everything they're trying to build now with respect to BRICS and their relationship with the neo-colonial world is all related to the activities of the USSR. So that's the legacy, and which of course stems from the Stalin period and the Lenin period. The man they never mentioned, the man whose mausoleum they still cover up. Without him, without his legacy, Lenin, that is, they wouldn't be able to do any of this. But they're claiming they're claiming more and more of the legacy of the Soviet Union now. They're claiming that they are the direct continuation of the Soviet period, which of course that's not exactly true. United Russia has its roots in certain elements of the old Soviet party, but certainly is not the continuator of the revolutionary traditions of that party. So, I mean, the point I'm making here is there's going to be, when the special military operation is brought to a close, which it will be at some point soon, and it will be brought to a close successfully. Militarily, I've made my position clear on this. I don't think there's much that the US can do or really wants to do with regard to taking on the Russians directly. Ultimately, this war will be decided how the Russian government wants to end it. That will be the grounds upon which it ends. After that is done, I mean, you're going to be getting a lot of guys who've been through the army for an extended period of time, who've fought and shed blood for the defense of Russia. And you're still going to be having a lot of problems associated with Russian capitalism. So I think the prospects for building the Communist Party in Russia are going to be much better. The prospects for building a militant organization of workers are going to be much better than they have been for many, many years. The power of the West, the power that it held over Russian intelligentsia, I don't know whether it's been broken, but it's certainly been severely damaged. And the closest ally to Russia will be a country which is still describes itself, opinions vary on the validity of this, but describes itself as being on a path to socialism. That is China, of course. So all those are factors which strongly speak in favor of the strengthening of socialist revolutionary forces inside Russia. Now, I'm not going to sit here and predict how that's going to go, but I think the prospects are much better now than they were 5 years ago, never mind 10 years ago. Hello from back to, I should say, Almir in the once and future Yugoslavia. Hello to Sid Hatfield. Hello to Rupert and Arcane Eclectic and Ian in Colchester and Albert and Ramon Mercado joins us. Hello to you, sir. Hello to Rob from the wrong side of the Pennines. Hello to Beans as well. Hello to TG Wilson. Albert just got through the introduction to Das Kapital Volume 2. Yeah, Mandel is one boring asshole. Ernest Mandel is the guy who does the introduction for the Penguin editions of Das Kapital, which is a typical case of using a trot to sabotage any interest people had in that book. Thankfully, thanks to a comrade who tipped me off about this, I've managed to get all 3 volumes of the old Soviet edition. I got them from a bookshop in Sheffield recently. Moving on. Hello to Cobb fan out there in Western Australia. Mouse SF joins us as well. Edward, who joins us and asks, why did Stalin and Marxist-Leninists not manage to identify the revisionists and pro-capitalists in the Politburo and the upper party like Khrushchev and Mikoyan? Many reasons, Edward. I mean, partially, maybe in the 30s, these two and others were keeping their head down and acting as, or at least appearing to act as, honest communists. Maybe in the 30s they weren't revisionists. I mean, Khrushchev is always described as very poorly politically educated. I mean, I'm from Molotov. So again, the question over whether he had any solid beliefs in anything at all is open to debate. So my first answer is that perhaps they weren't always revisionists. My second answer is perhaps they hid themselves well, followed orders, saluted when the time came, and tried desperately to blend in. And given everything else that was going on in the 30s and the 40s, it's not always possible to spot the revisionists, especially if they appear to be loyal comrades. And the revisionism only becomes clear when Stalin's dead and it's too late. So, the Soviet revisionism probably merits a whole program to itself, but it's not always possible to spot them, unfortunately. Hello to Matt Volmer, who joins us from a warehouse in Ontario, Canada. Hello to Tim Gray. Hello to Massimiliano Urbani. Let's also see Waverly 610. Hello. Hello to Robert from Staten Island. Hello to Yuan from Phoenix, Arizona. Hello to Bisquick, who says, shout out to Jeff Shurik's new book, Blue Collar Empire, The Untold Story of U.S. Labor's Global Anti-Communist Crusade. Yeah. Yeah, the AFL-CIA strikes again. Hello to Mo1917. Going down here. Albert says, I was brainwashed about the evil Stalin by the state and media and a few trots. Yeah, well, that happened to many of us, Albert. Let's carry on going here through some comments. Ramon Mercado says, or asks, is it true Trotsky thought the peasants were anti-Semitic? Trotsky hated the peasantry, never shared the prejudices of his class origin. But his class origin was, of course, that of a landowner, and he always had that attitude. Rista Costadino says Trotsky acted like the Afghan communists, never leaving their intellectual bubble in the city, never bothered to meet and talk with the peasants. Yeah, I've seen that criticism of the PDPA before. Seems to have some validity to it, from what I know. Most of the Afghanistan didn't know that the Communist Party was in charge until they started fighting the Mujahideen, because they were quite decentralized, mostly agrarian country. Yeah, it's the PDPA seems to me to be, they were based in the very small Afghan proletariat, the officer corps and the intellectuals. They never built a base in the peasants, or not much of one. So again, big problem, right? And that was exploited by the imperialists, as it is going to be. If you are not bringing on board the great majority of the country, which is still peasant, on board with you and addressing them in a way that they can relate to, then you are going to have problems, as the PDPA consistently did. And yes, Elmir, CPGBML, the party I am in, is the only Marxist-Leninist group in Britain. If you're in Britain and you want to, and you consider yourself to be a revolutionary, then you should sign up and help us build the only communist party worthy of the name in this country. Right. Bishi says, last time I was on strike, an old SWP guy came to our picket line. He basically had the approach described here. Didn't know a thing about our dispute and no one listened to him. Yep, familiar feeling. Sid Hatfield says, who was aware that Kermit Roosevelt and Miles Copeland, Stuart Copeland from the police's dad, were the principal agents responsible for the toppling of King Farouk and the ascendancy of Nasser in the early 50s? I've heard this before. Nasser has a very mixed past, shall we say. He did try to have good relations with the Americans for quite some time before they turned on him. So yeah, and also he played a very dubious game with regard to communists in Egypt. Like, he did repress the Communist Party in Egypt, I think. In fact, I know. Much like the Baathists did in Iraq, and in Syria from time to time as well. So these characters, although they are to be supported when they are attacked by imperialism, let us never give them halos or perform hagiographies for them, because these were some characters who did have roots in, or did have support within the bourgeois, and were very keen to keep that bourgeois support on board, and that included taking anti-communist measures. Hello to Ash, who's catching up on double speed. I sound like him on coke. I deny those accusations. I never even met those dealers. Arnold says Vanessa Redgrave delivered food parcels to the Miners' Welfare Club during the 84 to 85 strike. Nice woman, very tall. Well, she ran for Parliament twice, the WRP, right round where I live now. Yes, Ash says there seems to be quite the Australian fan base out there. Well, Australian comrades are joining. Australians, if you're all watching in the same chat, be sure to get in touch with each other. Australia needs a strong communist party. Certainly, with the devious plans that the US imperialists have for Australia in regard to forcing a war with China, and the fact that you'll be the front line of it. If the US and the Brits get their way. Don't think for a moment, and none of us in the imperialist countries or the ex-colonies, shall we say, should think for a moment that the imperialists in the end will hesitate before turning out all of us into a Ukraine situation. So Australia needs a strong communist party rooted in the great mass of the Australian working class, to prevent to block the plans that the US imperialists have for Australia, and also to bring down the pathetic selection of scumbags that run the Australian state, and the pathetic Australian ruling class as well. A group which made their money off relations with China, but are basically dominated by the United States, or made a lot of money off relations or trade relations with China. So Australians, I'm sure many of you are in communist parties already, but if you're not, then organization is the key here, comrades, in every country at all times. Right, moving on. Rob's been to the same bookshop as me. Well, in all honesty, we're not too far away from each other. In England, in Britain, really, we like our regional rivalries, but our regional rivalries must look tiny when if you're in Australia or you're in the United States, and you look at the fact that myself and the Yorkshire comrades are only like 40 miles away from each other. You lot probably think that we basically are living in the same area, but the smallness of Britain only amplifies the regional divisions. Basically, you can have a very fierce rivalry with people who live in the next valley, and we often do. And these are very unforgiving rivalries. I jest, but you know, local banter, so to speak, is part of our culture. Bruce says, glad you're reading Stalin. Unlike Zelensky, he does not use untoward language. Well, Stalin was a more eloquent man than Zelensky could ever be. He also has not had his brain destroyed by cocaine. Okay, so hello to Alan Smith, who's out there in communist Dixieland. All right, so 495 of you watching. Thanks to everybody who's tuned in. I'm going to bring things to a close for today. Join me tomorrow, where same time, same place, 10:30. We will be doing a Christmas special. Don't quite know what it's going to be consisting of yet. It may just be me taking questions from the audience for an hour or two. But join me for that. We'll be seeing in Christmas, the Western Christmas. I'm aware that those of you who are perhaps watching this in the Orthodox lands have a different date. And those of you out there who don't celebrate it at all are thinking, what the fuck is this guy on about? So join me tomorrow, 10:30 British time, 5:30 East Coast American time. You know what? For tomorrow, I'll try and learn all the different time zones. And so I can bring everybody into the time check. All right. Thanks to everybody who's joined the stream today. Thanks for all the comments and questions. Thanks to our growing Australian contingent. Big shout out to all of you. Maybe we'll do a cricket special one day and you can hurl insults at English cricket for an hour. Right. And be sure to like and share this program. Thanks to everybody who supports the show on Patreon. Patreon Christmas message special thing coming up tomorrow as well. Be sure to tune in for that. But if I don't speak to you before the day itself, have a communist Christmas. I'll see you again soon.
वतन 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 दा दिल अफगान वतन दा पमूंग गान वतन दा पमूंग गान वतन दा पमूंग गान वतन और द गैरत जलजले लरी तूफान लरी रूम की बाजार लरी रूम की बाजार लरी रूम की बाजार लरी और द गैरत जलजले लरी तूफान लरी रूम की बाजार लरी रूम की बाजार लरी जले लरी तूफान लरी खून के बासान लरी